with us today at the New Indian. This is the New Indian's Reason show, where we get to the reason of the issues that concern our audience. So, my first question to you, Mr. Imtiaz Gul, is what exactly happened in Pakistan? How did Pakistan come to this point where Imran Khan, who was supposedly an elected prime minister, and then there was a no confidence vote against him. How did it happen?
Well, I think it's multiple factors that led to the exit of Imran Khan. He has to blame himself partially, as well as the status quo forces which have been arrayed against him. He came to power with the agenda of reform, agenda of tabdili, but he didn't realize that he was banking on a number of people for reform who themselves were part of the status quo. And there we where this is where he went wrong. He basically also allowed himself to be hoodwinked by a number of bureaucrats around him. And then I think he just tried to assert himself without any real ground support in a situation where he was facing a bureaucracy that had been addicted to, more tuned to the Sharif family, to the Zardari and Bhuttos, as well as to the military in the last 20 years. And this man came and started abusing the bureaucracy, talking of all possible reforms and basically holding the bureaucracy responsible for Pakistan's ills. Whereas he, I think, didn't realize that this is an entire architecture comprising the military, the politicians, the bureaucracy, and a very pliant, conventional, conformist business community, which together basically govern Pakistan. They have always held together whenever challenged. So, in the end, I would say that Imran Khan's exit became possible, or the no confidence motion, which was tabled by 13 parties against a single person who really didn't have any uh, any negative record as far as the economy is concerned. So you can imagine that 13 parties joined hands for the vote of no confidence to see the back of Imran Khan. And this is how it came about. And this probably the intriguing part was also the uh, the military, which had decided, in the words of many retired generals, to stay neutral as far as this conflict is concerned. But what this one you have to basically admit, the military establishment is an inseparable part of Pakistan's political economy, because this institution considers itself as the guardian of the territory that is called Pakistan. And you start ruffling their feathers. They start becoming uncomfortable when they see things are going wrong. So behind the scenes, they must have played some role, but the primary factor, I would say, for the departure of Imran Khan was his own shortcomings, his own failures on the front of bureaucratic reforms, administrative reforms. So there were many factors that led to his departure.
Okay, let me ask a fundamental question. When Imran Khan was elected as Prime Minister of Pakistan 4 years ago, uh, lot of reports that came out of Pakistan, some of the columns that came out of Pakistan indicated that he was Pakistan Army's choice, that he had the blessings of Pakistan military and General Bajwa. What went sour between Pakistan Army and Imran Khan, even as he was their blue-eyed boy once upon a time?
I think the whoever is in Islamabad is the blue-eyed boy for the general headquarters, and you should basically go back to my timeline on Twitter, I tweeted a voice clip of former Prime Minister Shahid Khaqan Abbasi. So that I think sheds enough light on the nature of elections that take place. A former prime minister who is part of a very loyalist, big loyalist of the Sharif family says every election in Pakistan has been manipulated. So now we are heading into another election. So should we presume that even the next election will be manipulated? So that's a big question, a subject of debate. You're talking about the sour points between Imran Khan and the military establishment. Obviously, the differences of approach on relations with China and the United States, and Imran Khan's attempt to pursue a policy, an look east policy, which meant basically uh, greater affinity, greater interaction with China, and of late also with Russia. Russia, became an eyesore for everybody. But it's very obvious that the moment Imran Khan started asserting himself, taking certain decisions. Some of them did not have much merit, but obviously he was the chief executive, and as the chief executive, he thought he was entitled to certain decisions. But obviously, it created ripples in the general headquarters, and then the cleavage between the general headquarters and the prime minister house continued to widen.
You made a couple of pertinent points. One, you talked about Pakistan as a democracy or not a democracy. Is Pakistan really a democracy? Even as there have been elections, and even as you're going to have yet another election, and you will have an elected prime minister at some stage, do you really think that Pakistan is a democracy? Because given the amount of influence and power that Pakistan army wields, how will you define Pakistan as a state?
I think Pakistan is very much a democracy. Regardless of its flaws, Pakistan has its own particular peculiar context to democracy, where the armed forces have an definite certain role, an inseparable part of the political economy, and that doesn't and should not belittle the parliamentary system that currently we have in Pakistan. And look, there are three long stints by the army generals, by the dictators. But then the rest of the time, in the last 74 years, we have seen civilian governments, most of them, and the last 2 decades in particular. Um, if we compare ourselves with Japan post-war 1945 or with Italy post 1945, both have had 3 to 4 dozen governments, change of governments in as many years. So that should not belittle the parliamentary structure that we have. Uh, I think we have seen two governments complete their term. This government could complete only 3 years and 7 months. Obviously, there were problems, shortcomings in the government's policies, but then there's we this also goes back to the balance of power that needs to be taken care of, needs to be taken into consideration when we are talking of democracy. Nothing is automatic. The authority, comes with the passage of time. The authority comes with good governance, with the improvement in the political
But
economy.
in the last 75 years, uh, you obviously should be comparing yourself with India, you should be comparing yourself with South Asian countries rather than Italy or Japan, because we all, especially with India, you were born on the same month, if not the same date, but in the last 75 years, Pakistan's trajectory has hardly been that of a democratic republic, with 4 military coups and then enormous influence of army in almost every sphere, every institution including the choice of prime ministers. It seems Pakistan Army rules the roost.
In a way, yes. Uh, just because we have had also political ruling elite, which is more wedded to its own interests, its own economic financial interests than to the interests of the people on whose shoulders they ride into power. So this has been a dilemma for Pakistan, that every time there is a civilian government, we have seen then a surge in corruption, and that is systemic corruption. No government, no civilian prime minister has really attended to the pressing issue of changing the system, the, for instance, public sector procurement systems, which has so many elements of inherent corruption that you cannot even detect. But I personally have been speaking to a number of politicians. There is no will to change that procurement system. And on the contrary, even the World Bank has injected a lot of money to improve so-called improve the procurement systems. Basically, a lot of money, millions of dollars, 300, $450 million went into the improvement, for instance, of the procurement systems. But to what avail? The national kitty continues to bleed because of this. And there is not a single politician ready to change that just because they themselves are also beneficiary of that. So whenever the civilians are in power, nobody stops them from investing the money that is allocated for education, for health, for roads.
You seem to be indicating that Imran Khan tried to change that. He tried to force reforms. He tried to change the bureaucracy, but he failed. At the same time, you're actually saying that Imran Khan and Bajwa got alienated from each other because of their outlook on foreign policy, their different approaches to America as well as China. I mean, Bajwa is clearly pro America, and given the statements that Imran Khan has made of late, it seems that he's pro China. So, are you really saying that Imran Khan was a different prime minister from the rest of the league, and he really tried to change the systemic corruption that Pakistan has been facing for the last 75 years? Or are you saying that he really, there was a bone of contention over the foreign policy approach between the military and the civilian leadership?
It is both. It's not just one disagreement on foreign policy, but also I think internally there were formidable challenges. He opened too many fronts. This was one big blunder that Imran Khan committed. He wanted to take on everybody, and in a cesspool, you can't take on everybody. There's only limitation where to your capacity to deal with the filth, the problems around yourself. And this is, I think, where he went wrong. And also, we have to basically take into account the economic indicators, which largely go in favor of what PTI government did in its 3.7 years. One of a very young chartered accountant, has recently put together a chart comprising 12 indicators. 10 of the 12 indicators are either improvement or massive improvement as far as the economic indicators are concerned. Only two are in the negative. One is inflation, which is very much present in India as well as in the rest of the world. Baitered, the economies have been baitered by the inflation because of the COVID crisis, COVID disruption. And the other negative is current account balance of payment, a current account deficit, because our imports are more than double the size of our exports. Otherwise, the performance in the like governmental revenue, the exports have risen by more than 25% in the last 3.5 years, whereby they remained stagnant under the PPP and the Pakistan Muslim League government between 2008 and 2018. So there are many indicators whose impact will be seen in the long run. Our only predicament has been the is so-called hyper-nationalism that Imran Khan demonstrated vis-a-vis the United States, vis-a-vis the European Union, and then obviously it plays, it gets, um, I don't know how to describe it, but when you deploy hyper-nationalism, then you don't make many friends. And this is what eventually happened. It made the other ruling elites uncomfortable, prompting even Shahbaz Sharif to say that beggars can't be the choosers. You know, this was a slur that he cast on the state of Pakistan. But to a certain extent, he was right because the economy is currently beholden to the IMF extended credit facility, and Pakistan had to comply with many tough, stringent conditions, and that's why these talks are currently stalled. So there are many contradictions
So
within.
when you say hyper nationalism, are you really referring to Imran Khan's justification and even encouragement of extremist religious extremist groups like Taliban, Tehrik-e-Labbaik? In fact, Imran Khan has had the same approach as his predecessors and the Pakistan army vis-a-vis Hizbul Mujahideen, Lashkar-e-Taiba, and Jaish-e-Mohammed, which are India-centric terror groups. There isn't. What is the difference between Imran Khan and his predecessors or the Pakistan army? Because Pakistan army itself has been a supporter of Taliban. Various other governments in place in Pakistan in the last 10-20 years at one or the other state supported Taliban. Tehrik-e-Labbaik has supporters. Then Kashmir-centric terror groups remain intact, and nobody really has had any issues with any of those terror groups. How is Imran Khan the only one who gets blamed for Islamic terrorism or Islamic extremism in Pakistan?
I think this is a narrative that his detractors have constructed. The TLP, I don't think the PTI would have anything to do with the TLP, and I don't know which Taliban are you talking about. Are you talking about the Afghan Taliban? If you're
No,
talking,
Afghan, of course, Afghan Taliban, because Pakistan Taliban, obviously, nobody likes, whether it's Imran Khan or the Pakistan army.
yeah, so you also have to be cognizant of the fact that the Afghan Taliban are a reality. Reality, they were handed basically a peace deal with by the United States, not by Pakistan. They held on for so long in Afghanistan because they are so-called sons of soil. And anybody's, I think Pakistan as a bordering country with 2,560-kilometer long border couldn't have remained uh, insensitive to what was happening next door. And that's why Pakistan has been very much involved politically as far as having an eye on the events there is concerned. And you cannot actually practically stop the people from coming and going to Afghanistan. We have this long border, we have people with businesses, relationships, both sides. There was a time when 50 to 60,000 people were crossing the border at two or three major entry points. And a lot of people, even terrorists, were commuting between these two countries. They don't carry the tag of a terrorist or a Taliban on their face, so they all carry their passports. Many of them had, our systems are systematically corrupt, so a lot of them had also gotten Pakistani passports. So they were coming and going. They had many possessed Pakistani national ID cards because of the endemic corruption within the systems. So it's not. I think the Afghan Taliban situation or the story is entirely different. The entire world was talking to them. Even now, the all major countries have their informal relationship with the Afghan Taliban. So I think the what Imran Khan had been saying, and what a lot of Pakistanis have been saying since 2001, that there would be no military solution to Afghanistan, and that you shall have to talk to them. And in December 2019, then President Donald Trump requested
So,
Pakistan
in
to.
a way, what you are saying is that uh, all these extremist groups whether it's Tehreek Taliban Afghanistan, or Tehreek Labbaik, or Jaish-e-Mohammed, or Hizbul Mujahideen, Al Qaeda, any of these extremist groups, you basically have to, essentially, you have to talk to them at some point. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I guess, I mean, the TLP represents a lot of hardline Muslims, practicing Muslims. I mean, they ended up as runner-up or at number three in various elections. This is a reality you cannot reject out of hand. The way the RSS people are there, or BJP hardliners. So it's TLP, is they are very much part of the society. Earlier they were
Let
part.
me
No,
interrupt
let me
you.
finish. Let me finish my point. This is this is a party that was born out of Pakistan Muslim League, because Pakistan Muslim League represented the right wing, and of course they were far right that traditionally had supported the Pakistan Muslim League, various factions of it. And once the TLP came into being, a lot of people broke away and joined the TLP, and that's why they ended up number two or number three in Karachi, in Punjab, many constituencies of Punjab. So, do you want to bomb them? Do you want to smoke them while they are living in populated
Good
clusters of
question.
Punjab and Karachi?
Let me ask a counter question, and I'm the one who's asking questions today. So the issue here is that there are extremist groups. There are groups which have hardline positions, which have hardline views, and then there are groups which are out and out terror groups, designated as terror groups by not just India but by the United Nations. There are terror groups designated by the United States. Now the issue is, what is how do you make a distinction between groups with rigid point of view and groups which go beyond that rigid point of view. They essentially take up arms and they take law into their hands and they become unlawful groups. They become terror groups. In this particular case, what we are really saying is Taliban, even before the US talked to Taliban, or even before Pakistan was supporting the idea of dialogue with Taliban. So you're saying that Taliban was just a group with rigid points of view. And you are making no distinction between Taliban in Afghanistan, Taliban in Pakistan, or Al Qaeda, or ISIS, or Hizbul Mujahideen. You are saying that they're all extremist groups. They're not really terror groups. Is that
No,
what you
don't.
say?
No, I never said this. Don't put words in my mouth. I think you are mixing up many things.
No,
Uh,
because I asked you this question and you
yeah.
said, do you
No.
bomb them? Terror groups are to be bombed, I suppose.
No. Look, TLP is something different. It's a Pakistani context. When you're talking about Lashkar or Jaish or Jamaat or Dawa, they have been, I think, Hafiz Saeed has been convicted in 5 or 6 cases. But they also represent a lot
And
of people,
the
a lot of
main,
citizens of Pakistan. Let me finish my point, right? Because you are mixing up things. You are talking in the same breath you're talking about the Afghan Taliban, and the same breath you're talking about
because you
ISIS.
made a
Uh,
point that
no,
why
no, no, please. Let's either you ask me a question about Afghan Taliban and who they are supporting or who they are sheltering. Or you ask me about TLP, Jamaatul Dawa, who are in Pakistan. In Pakistan, whether it's Jamaatul Dawa, whether it's Jaish, whether it's ISIS, whether it's Al Qaeda, and just there are 78, at least 78 outlawed groups, and they all these are included. But TLP couldn't be outlawed just because even the government of Nawaz Sharif gave in to them. This government also had to give in to them because they had so much nuisance value. They participated in the elections. The election commission then eventually allowed them to participate in the election, and they also almost won a few seats. So this is the reality of Pakistan. But this does not mean that the mainstream Pakistani parties are like that. 95, 96% of the votes go to the mainstream parties, not to TLP. So let's not confuse things. And the Afghan Taliban, Pakistan itself has a problem now with the Afghan Taliban for sheltering Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, the TTP, and several other terror groups, Ahrar-ul Hind and Daesh and ISIS, ISK, Al-Qaeda. So Pakistan itself has been now talking to the Afghan Taliban, demanding an action against all these terror groups. The Taliban, Afghan Taliban, have so far been reluctant, just because at some level, ideological level, they're all one, and the
Exactly.
the Afghan Taliban don't want to antagonize these groups who they have been sheltering. And there's also a tribal tradition to this. We cannot totally disregard the tribal mindset, tribal traditions. The Afghan Taliban, Mullah Omar, their chief, led this country into war on terror, just because he did not want to surrender his guest. So the Pashtuns don't surrender their guests, and this was much more tribal mindset at work than ideological nexus with the Al Qaeda. So he refused to turn over Al Qaeda leaders, and instead he chose to take on the United States, which pushed the country, sank the country into this war. So we also have to keep that in mind, and that's why this is the same reason why they are not now going against TTP, against Daesh, against ISK, and many other, against IMU. So we really have to distinguish between the
Good.
groups when.
I'm glad you clarified that, because my question was that Imran Khan actually fanned all these elements. His government, during his government, we saw, as you pointed out yourself, that he was hyper nationalist. I don't think it's hyper nationalism. I think it is he was really encouraging Islamic religious radicals.
No,
No?
no, sorry, so I'll totally disagree with that. The bedrock of PTI's support, or the base of PTI support, is all very educated people, affluent, middle class, upper middle class. So this is a tag that the Western media attached to Imran Khan. Yes, he has been demonstrating religiosity, but you cannot call it extremism. This is a fatal error that a lot of outsiders commit by calling him Taliban Khan or extremist. This is a very unfair, I wouldn't say nonsensical, but very unfair tag that is attached to Imran Khan. Uh, Going by that, I think then the entire Pakistan would be extremist, but then they wouldn't be voting for the PPP, PMLN, and PTI. They should be then voting for Jamaat Islami, for Jamiatul Ulama Islam, for TLP. And all these parties have been marginalized, absolutely marginalized. With Jamiatul Ulama Islam just has one seat in the national parliament. It has just 6 or 7 MPs in the provincial parliament in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. It has just 7 or 8 out of 65 MPs in the Balochistan Assembly, and this is the area of Jamiat Ulama support. Jamaat Islami has been totally eliminated from the scene, and these were the traditional, conventional, fundamentalist parties of Pakistan. Nobody votes for them except for a few pockets where they still draw some support. But to characterize religiosity as extremist is another failure, another
Let
mistake
me
that a lot of
let
outsiders
me
have been
give you
committing.
let me give you an example. Uh, Imran Khan, in his last 4 years, on almost every platform across the world, and he wrote several columns in NYT, Washington Post, calling India a Hindu fascist country, and he called Prime Minister Modi names. He has not left even one single opportunity where he did not paint India in fascistic terms. And at the same time, he was himself justifying and actually glorifying a well-known, self-admitted Hizbul Mujahideen commander Burhan Wani and Zakir Musa. Both were terrorists. Both were self-admittedly proponents of Caliphate. Both were self-admittedly the warriors of jihad in Kashmir. And you are saying that Imran Khan was not really fanning Islamic extremism.
I think this is how can we equate actually his criticism of Modi and BJP and RSS as Islamic extremism? This I'm really at a loss. How could you draw this
I said
parallel?
two
No,
things.
sorry.
I said two
You
things.
cannot draw this parallel. I
I
think
said
what I
two
was
things.
talking about what. Sorry, I don't want to get drawn into this, but this is a very far-fetched analogy that you have drawn. How can you equate somebody? The United Nations has just passed a resolution a month ago against Islamophobia and declaring March 15 as a day, universal day for Islamophobia, against Islamophobia. So,
This is Islamophobia.
see,
Imran Khan, Imran
look,
Khan,
look,
Imran
look,
Khan supporting
I don't want
Zakir
to,
Musa is Islamophobia.
I don't want to
I,
get into this
so
argument.
you're not
Thought,
answering my question.
no, no, no. I just don't want to go into this. I
You're not
thought
answering my
discussing
question.
Pakistan's current situation. I think we have discussed this. And when you're drawing an absolutely nonsensical analogy, I cannot respond to that.
It's not
And
nonsensical.
it
How is
is.
it nonsensical
What
that
is
Imran Khan goes around the world and he talks in front of the international community, praising and glorifying Burhan Wani and Zakir
Will
Musa
it ask the Kashmiris?
self-admittedly,
You can
self-admittedly,
ask the
I'm a Kashmiri,
you can ask the
I'm,
Kashmiri whether they consider him
I'm
a
a Kashmiri, I'm a
terrorist.
Kashmiri, and I'm telling you this.
You are a Kashmiri from the other side, no? So,
What
uh,
other side?
well,
You so there,
look,
that's the prejudice that you hold against non-Muslims, and you are saying
look,
that the
look,
world is Islamophobic.
look. The let's not get into this. This is not a debate. I have responded to your questions in whatever way I could. It's always in the world. Somebody's terrorist is somebody else's freedom fighter.
All
So
right, so
to-
you're also
we should.
justifying
I
Hizbul Mujahideen
I
and Lashkar-e-Taiba.
I would go by what the majority of Kashmiris in Srinagar,
Majority,
call
majority,
Burhanu.
majority, majority. Do you know Jammu and Kashmir? Jammu and Kashmir also has
Look,
Dogra.
I think, sorry, I don't want
Yeah.
to get
So
into this.
let's not get into this because
This is again a typical.
you're now justifying terrorism on a platform.
I'm not justifying
You
terrorism.
are.
This
You justifying.
Kashmiris know that is terrorism.
You justifying the existence of Hizbul Mujahideen and Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Taiba.
I never did that.
You when I say that Zakir
You are
Musa
putting
and
words in
Burhan
my.
Wani,
No, sorry, I
you're
cannot.
constantly contradicting yourself.
Look, I thought we will have a decent conversation,
It
but
is a
this is
recent
again a
conversation.
typical. This is
If you,
again a typical Indian perspective that is
it
drawing
is
me,
not a
trying
typical.
to
It's
draw
a.
me
I'm
into an.
asking you questions
I
and you
don't
are
have
not
time.
able.
Sorry, I don't
Yes.
have time for all these questions. Thank you very much.
All right.
I appreciate your views. You are entitled to your views, but do not debate or counter question when
Why can't
somebody, this is not the.
counter question? Why shouldn't I ask questions? Why
You have
shouldn't I
asked
counter
questions.
question you? If
You
there
have
are contradictions in what you're saying, then it is my right to ask.
you have
It
asked
is
questions.
my right to ask
Entitled to
questions.
your opinion, to questions. I responded to them, and their questions. I think I do not want to respond to. I do not want this interview to degenerate into a tutu meme.
Absolutely, we're not degenerating this conversation into a slanging match. I'm asking very valid, rational questions that
Well,
either you
rational again.
either you're not supporting.
Rationality, you cannot determine or define rationality by
Now we
your
are
own
moving
prism.
into philosophical
This is a
debate.
very subjective.
You want to do a philosophical debate?
Look, I think we have had enough, right?
Yes, yes. All
So,
right. Thank you so much for
thank you very much.
being with us. Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you.